So we begin our discussion on psychological disorders by considering the question of what is a psychological disorder? How do we determine when behavior crosses the boundary from just odd or unusual into being categorized as a psychological disorder? This raises quite a few questions for us, including how should we define psychological disorders? How do we go about understanding them? How should we classify them? These are the kinds of questions that we'll entertain in this particular chapter. So to answer the question of what is a psychological disorder, we need to understand that a psychological disorder is different from other experiences in that there will be a difficulty for the individual in regulating their thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. And this is going to be substantially different from what we experience when we're just having erratic feelings or unusual feelings. These are going to be differences that cause actual disruption in our everyday functioning. Now, when we talk about defining psychological disorders, we also have to take in mind that psychological disorders are sometimes different in the way that they appear in different cultures. They've also been different from time to time in history. In other words, at one time in history, something might be considered a psychological disorder, whereas at another time in history it might not. Here's a brief table just outlining some of the common disorders and how many people in the United States have had them in the past year. So as you can see, the particular disorders that we'll be talking about are not really that prevalent, but you see that some people, the highest number is less than 10% of the population. So plenty of people experience psychological disorders when you take all these numbers together, but they're not large numbers so that everybody in the population is experiencing them. So in relation to that previous slide, I want to give a disclaimer. Oftentimes when we start talking about psychological disorders, because of the fact that these disorders are based in behaviors that we all experience, it's easy to begin to think, oh my goodness, I think I have that disorder. I want you to take a moment and give yourself permission to understand that you don't necessarily have a disorder because it sounds similar to something you've experienced, but because these behaviors are all based in experiences that we have, but then go up to a different extreme, they will sound familiar to us. It's also important in understanding psychological disorders to understand that people have struggled throughout time with understanding mental illness. And because it hasn't always been well understood, the approach to it at times has been horrendous. So for instance, back in the Middle Ages, people thought of mental illnesses as problems with people being possessed by demons. And as a result of that, the way that they approached treatment was oftentimes cruel. Sometimes it was exorcism, sometimes it was removing a part of the brain, administering electric shock to induce convulsions, giving people insulin to induce convulsions. And so there came a time when a particular person, Philippe Pinel, began to oppose all of these barbaric treatments and tried to help people to understand that mental illness was a sickness of the mind and that these inhumane treatments were not helpful, but that the people deserved more humane treatments. And he started a process called moral treatment with that in mind of how to help people in a more humane way. Eventually, we came to a point where it was noticed that people who had syphilis, once they died, they examined their brains, and they found that people who had syphilis were impacted by that illness, that it actually changed their behaviors. And once we became aware of that, there was a great interest in finding out what other types of physical phenomena could impact a person's behaviors. And so this was the beginning of people starting to look at the physiological approach, something that's connected to the medical model, where we actually assign mental illness to various processes in the body. For instance, disruptions in neurotransmitters, irregularities in structures of the brain, and other processes in the body. So that led us to the approach that we speak of today as the biopsychosocial approach. It's actually the bio part, but remember today I talked about how we combine some of the approaches so that we can consider both the biological aspects of the illness, the psychological aspects of the illness, and the environmental or social influences as well. So to begin talking about the various disorders, we will start with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, more commonly referred to as ADHD. This is a controversial disorder in some respects, in that years and years ago, there was no such thing as ADHD. So in the past, when children were full of energy, perhaps being inattentive, we just considered that a part of their normal behavior, that maybe they were just full of high energy. So today people question the number of people who are being diagnosed with ADHD and placed upon medication. Some folks wonder whether indeed children who have a lot of energy, who are facing situations that are maybe not natural, sitting in a classroom for hours and hours at a young age, they're wondering if maybe a diagnosis of ADHD is not fair or accurate for such children. And further, they wonder about the long-term effects of being treated with these medications that they use to get the symptoms of ADHD under control. Some of the symptoms include inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. And so oftentimes in school, when the teacher notices that a child is having difficulty paying attention, maybe difficulty sitting still in their seats, being very impulsive in the things that they do, they will refer them, and often those children get diagnosed with ADHD. Classification is an important part of understanding psychological disorders. And so by categorizing and classifying disorders, it allows the people who work with the psychological disorders to be on the same page about what that disorder is. So by classifying, we provide a name for the disorder and a description of the specific symptoms that are related to that disorder, so that every clinician who works with someone with that disorder knows what to look for as far as symptoms and shares the same name in their communications with others. A second benefit of classification is that once we know what those symptoms are that we're able to describe in the classification, we're also able to predict what's going to happen with a person when they have that disorder, what kinds of symptoms we'll see, what kind of behaviors we'll see. And then third, that will also allow us to research and investigate the best treatments for that disorders, so that those who are faced with someone who has that disorder knows that they can look at a body of literature, find the best treatment, and give that person the best treatment that they possibly can. The classification system that's in use in the United States is based upon the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And the 5 refers to that it's in the 5th edition, which is its most recent edition. In this most recent edition, which actually hasn't even been out an entire year yet, There have been some changes in some of the um, categorization of disorders. For instance, in the prior edition, there was a disorder called autism, and there was a disorder called Asperger's. In the new edition, they've put those disorders together under the same label, and that label is autism spectrum disorder. And the reason they did that is because they believe that those disorders have similar features but are at different levels on a continuum. Another change is that from mental retardation to the label of intellectual disability. There are also some new or altered diagnoses such as prolonged bereavement, depression. Of course, there's some controversy about this because this bereavement has to do with grieving over the loss of a loved one. And many people believe that that it's wrong to classify that as a mental disorder, as grieving is a natural part of our living experience. But others believe that bereavement can become complicated when a person is having difficulty getting over their grief and moving on. Our classification system is not without criticism. One of the biggest criticisms is that it's difficult sometimes to get all of the clinicians to see the disorders as similarly as we would like through the use of the classification system. Oftentimes there are so many symptoms that are included in a description of a disorder that it makes it difficult to really pin down what that disorder looks like. Now, some of the reason is that they have so many symptoms is that people are so individual in the way that they express a particular disorder. So for one thing, it's very difficult to narrow it down to where you could say everybody who has depression is going to experience this, because that's not true. So there are some disorders that when we look at it with research and we're looking at how well clinicians do at accurately identifying those particular disorders, the clinicians don't do too well. Antisocial personality disorder is an example of one, as is generalized anxiety disorder. Other criticism has to do with those folks who really believe that by calling certain behaviors a mental illness or a mental disorder, that we are pathologizing the experiences that each of us have in everyday life. And then too, there's quite a bit of criticism around the use of labels in general, that perhaps we just label those behaviors that we don't value within our society, and so we call those behaviors disorders when perhaps they're really not disorders. However, even with the criticisms, taking those criticisms into account, there are some benefits in using the DSM system. It certainly helps, as I mentioned before, mental health professionals to be able to communicate, to be on the same page in their understanding about many of the disorders that they encounter. Additionally, it's useful in research to categorize the disorders, because then it gives people a direction to search, a direction in which to search to find out more about the disorders, more about the causes of the disorders, and more about the treatments of the disorders.